So, dear viewers, dear friends of the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, dear members, dear audience, it is my great pleasure to appear here today in my capacity as the new director of the Institute. However, this is, as we all know, a sad day. I would therefore like to start this webinar by quoting the Swedish Prime Minister this morning, statements worth repeating. Russia's attack today on Ukraine is unprovoked, illegal, and indefensible. It threatens international peace and security, and it is a flagrant breach of international law and the European security order. The responsibility for this falls entirely on the Russian political leadership. End of quote. And let me add that we see this as a new and dark chapter in Europe's history. This is probably the worst military aggression in Europe since the Second World War. It is not only an attack on Ukraine, but the security of the whole of Europe, and which means that it concerns us all. When a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council conducts a military act like this, it will also have far-reaching consequences for the international order. Lastly, and most importantly, on this sorrowful day, we must not forget the human suffering. This is a man-made humanitarian crisis, and all our thoughts go to the victims. So, despite this horrific turn of events in Ukraine, we have decided to go on with this webinar today. However, due to the situation, we have made some changes in the program. As you will have seen in the invitation, State Secretary Robert Floyd was supposed to deliver opening remarks. He is busy with the current crisis and will be replaced by Deputy Director Ann-Sophie Nilsson, who is also head of the Department for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. And he will deliver State Secretary Rydberg's remarks on his behalf. So we cannot afford not to focus on other global and pressing issues, despite the situation and the severity of today. Today, we will therefore talk about the efforts by the world community which contribute to save us from maybe the ultimate disaster, which a nuclear war would represent. And one extremely important piece of that puzzle is to stop nuclear testing. And more specifically, we will focus on questions like, why has the number of nuclear tests in the world decreased drastically since 1996? And how has the treaty banning nuclear testing contributed to international peace and security? Moreover, what are the main challenges to its implementation, and maybe more broadly to nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation? And lastly, what is Sweden's contribution to this equation? So in terms of the practicalities of this event, I would like to encourage all you viewers to send your questions through the Q&A function in the Zoom app if you join us by Zoom, or through the live stream if you join us by Facebook Live. And I will try to bring up as many of those questions as possible during this hour. But please help me to keep the questions short and precise. The run of show today will be that Ann-Sophie will deliver the opening remarks on behalf of the State Secretary, as I just said. Thereafter, we have a keynote address by our special guest today, Dr. Robert Floyd, Executive Secretary of CTBTO. And then I will open up for a panel discussion, also together with Vitaly Fichenko, who is a senior researcher from CIPRI. I will all introduce you more in detail in a moment. But we will now start by asking Ms. Ann-Sofie Nilsson to deliver the introductory remarks, as mentioned. Ann-Sofie, you are, as I said, the Deputy Director General and the head of the Department for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation here at the Swedish Foreign Ministry in Stockholm. You also used to be the Consul General at the Consulate General in Jerusalem during 4 years. And before that, you were also serving as the Director General for International Development Cooperation at the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Excellent background and a lot of experience, and my former colleague, very, very good person. It's really great to have you here, Ann-Sofie, and the floor is yours for the opening remark. So please, Ann-Sofie.
Thank you very much for inviting to today's webinar. I, of course, would like to start by thanking the Swedish Institute of International Affairs and especially you, Jakob, as Helgen, as the new director, and wish you all the best in your new endeavors here, even if we are starting on a very, as you said yourself, a dark chapter of European security, a dark day. I think we are all very taken by the events that we have seen happening. I also want to take the opportunity on behalf of State Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Robert Rydberg, convey his apologies for not being able to participate, but I'm sure everyone understands the very serious situation, and you have also referred to the Prime Minister's statements today and the government's strongest possible condemnation of Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine. But you also said, and I think that is very important to recognize that we need to continue working for peace, security. We need to continue work for multilateralism, for multilateral solutions, and for cooperation, not the least in days like this. Therefore, we are, of course, also very honored to welcome Dr. Robert Floyd, Executive Secretary of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization's Preparatory Commission, to Stockholm. It's the first time you're coming to visit us, but you know that Sweden is a strong supporter of the important work that you are undertaking together with your colleagues with regards to the Secretariat, and we really appreciate our close cooperation in promoting the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the CTBT, and its regime. So let me now turn to today's conversation, and I will share with you as a start a few points on behalf of State Secretary Robert Rydberg. And I will start with history. As you know, many of you that have followed this treaty from the very beginning, that there have been many Swedish politicians, diplomats, and technicians and scientists that really have worked tirelessly for many years in contributing to achieve a total ban on nuclear testing. That happened already in the 1970s when we had scientists from today's Swedish Defense Agency, the FOI, that put forward ideas on comprehensive test ban regime. And Sweden also presented draft treaties on a test ban in the 80s and in the 90s. It's been a long journey. And there is especially, one can probably mention many, but there is a Swedish scientist, he's well known to the CTBTO, Ola Dahlman, who played a very leading part in contributing to designing the CTBT's verification system and subsequently in putting it into place. So these are examples of political, diplomatic, and technical contributions that is part of forming the CTBT and is also part of the global nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime. Coming back to today, the regime, however, is under pressure. And needless to say, we are witnessing a heavily deteriorating global and European security situation. And we continue to witness the development of new nuclear capabilities, modernization of arsenals, questioning of well-established norms, and even abandonment of landmark arms control treaties. Our collective goal of a world free from nuclear weapons seems far away. And therefore, our work for nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation is more important than ever. The government has been very engaged in the Stockholm Initiative for Nuclear Disarmament that was launched by Sweden in 2019, together with 15 other countries from different regions and security contexts, aiming to mobilize political support for concrete progress on disarmament. That is a very recent but very strong Swedish engagement. And the initiative offers concrete and pragmatic measures for advancing, even in these days, on nuclear disarmament. And these include, among others, steps to reduce nuclear arsenals, to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in doctrines and policies, to enhance transparency, to support efforts to develop multilateral nuclear disarmament verification capabilities, and to achieve risk reduction. And it also includes, of course, the long overdue entry into force of the CTBT. The CTBT contributes to constraining the development of new nuclear weapons, and it fosters international peace and security. The urgency of its entry into force has been agreed upon within the Non-Proliferation Treaty framework, as well as the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly. And the CTBT is something truly unique. Despite it has not yet come into force, the treaty has cemented the global norm against nuclear testing, with one exception, North Korea. This norm has been adhered to by all since the beginning of the 21st century, and it has to stay that way. And despite de facto adherence to the norm against nuclear testing, and despite the continued urging by 170 ratifying states, a number of states have yet to sign and ratify the CTBT, including the 8 of the states whose ratifications are required for entry into force. And there can be no valid excuse for delaying action to sign and ratify this very important treaty that benefits everyone. And the CTBT, I will finalize with the CTBT verification regime. That is also very unique, providing the world with a truly global, high-tech monitoring system for nuclear explosions, something that no single country could do on its own. In addition to the CTBT's obvious contribution to international peace and security, the CTBTO assists states in using data from its international monitoring system for civilian and scientific applications. And finally, coming back to Sweden, Sweden also hosts such IMS stations, one of them equipped with a Swedish so-called SONA system for noble gas detection. That is developed in Sweden and quite a unique development, also connected to where I started saying how engaged we were in the 70s and onwards. And this is installed both out in Kista, but also further out in the world, and contribute to your verification system. So to conclude, on behalf of the State Secretary, Sweden's political and technical engagement against nuclear testing is steadfast. We will continue to do our part to ensure that nuclear tests are relegated once and all to the history books. I thank you.
Ann-Sofi, thank you so very much for those remarks on behalf of the State Secretary. Lots of interesting stuff there, I think. There is apparently a norm which has developed despite the fact that this treaty has not entered into force, and not only a norm, but there is also a verification regime where Sweden plays an important role historically and now. So lots of things to focus on in our discussion. And I think maybe our next speaker will touch on some of these issues and develop them and give us some of the more details. So Dr. Robert Floyd, Rob, it's a great pleasure to have you in Stockholm and at the Institute. Fantastic. And as Ann-Sofi said, it's the first visit for you here and for any executive secretary, I think, in a long time. You began your tenure in August last year, and you are the fourth executive secretary, I understand. So that's great. But prior to that, you were the Director General of the Australian Safeguards and Non-Proliferation Office for almost 10 years, I believe. So I cannot think of a better background for such a job, because in that capacity, you were responsible for Australia's implementation and compliance of various treaties and conventions, including the CTBT, of course, and NPT and others. So it's a real pleasure to have you here, and we are looking forward to listen to your keynote address today. Please, Rob, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Jakob, for your kind introduction. It's great to see you again, and it's great to be here in Stockholm for the first time in my capacity as Executive Secretary of the CTBTO. I also want to congratulate you on taking up this important position as Director of the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Today, events in Ukraine set a very sobering context to our discussion. All I want to say at this point is I sincerely hope that nuclear weapons have no part in this conflict. I'd first like to extend my appreciation also to Ann-Sofi and the government of Sweden for generously hosting my visit. I'd also like to thank the Swedish Institute of International Affairs for today's event. I wish there were more people in the room, but I'm glad there's a whole bunch of you out there in the digital world. I'm very pleased to join this timely roundtable discussion, which takes place while we are celebrating the 25th anniversary of the CTBT. I'm particularly grateful for Sweden's effort and long-standing support for nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. Among others, the Stockholm Initiative helps create unity of purpose and political support for agreement on practical and pragmatic steps towards nuclear disarmament. I deeply appreciate that Sweden has been such a strong partner to the CTBTO throughout the years. Its advocacy for the CTBT's entry into force and universalization has contributed greatly to the strengthening of the treaty and the global norm against nuclear testing. Beyond the political and financial support for the CTBT, I'm continually impressed by the substantial contribution Sweden has made in support of the verification regime. I acknowledge the foundational contribution of Ola Dahlman. For his contribution, it was truly the bedrock of some of the technical work within the CTBTO. And it's those kinds of contributions that help to build trust and confidence in our verification capabilities, thereby increasing the prospect of entry into force of the treaty. We are celebrating the 25th anniversary year of the opening for signature of the CTBT. This anniversary year provides us with opportunity to advance nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation agenda, to recognize our collective achievements, and to look forward to how we can work together to advance our shared goals. I view Sweden's support for the CTBT as instrumental to achieving our goals to bring the treaty into force and complete its verification regime. In my view, the treaty, the CTBT, itself is already a remarkable success. Since its adoption, the CTBT has created a robust and near universal norm against nuclear testing so powerful that less than a dozen tests have been conducted in the last 25 years, and only one country has conducted a nuclear test this millennium. I also remain firm in my belief that our collective effort to advance the CTBT's universalization will further strengthen the treaty and solidify the international norm against nuclear testing. We're undertaking strategic and multi-tracked outreach to advance this goal in this, the 25th anniversary year of the CTBT. I've set a target for us to achieve at least five additional ratifications by the end of the anniversary year this September. To give you context, in most years recently, we might have 1 or 0 new ratifications. Last year was 2, which is great, but I've set a goal for 5 in this, the anniversary year. I'm pleased to share with you that we are getting closer to universal legally binding ban on nuclear testing. Tuvalu and the Gambia have already completed their ratification process at the national level in this anniversary year. During my recent visit to Latin America and the Caribbean, Dominica's Prime Minister took the decision that the country would join the CTBT while I sat there in a meeting with him. With this important milestone, the Latin America and Caribbean region will soon achieve full adherence to the treaty. There are several other states that are moving quickly with their ratification processes as well. And I'm confident that this momentum will continue to build as we welcome more states into the CTBT family. I'm also committed to ensuring that countries derive the maximum benefits from the data collected through the international monitoring system, regardless of the size of their territory or of their economy. We will continue to offer capability development to help states to participate fully in the verification activities, as well as developing competencies in areas related to other civil and scientific applications of this data, such as disaster risk reduction, tsunami warning, and even climate change research. To give you some sense of the effectiveness of the international monitoring system, you might recall that in the middle of January, there was a major volcanic eruption in Tonga. This was the largest event ever recorded by the CTBTO infrasound network. And every one of our 53 certified infrasound arrays detected this massive event. It took place in Tonga, but even those scattered all the way around the globe picked it up. That is amazing. So those sound waves propagated through the atmosphere and were picked up, going all the different ways around this ball that we call home, and they heard it. But what was even more amazing, Jakob, some of those stations heard it twice, because the sound waves are captured in the atmosphere and they went around again. And some of those signals that were detected had traveled 80,000 kilometers and were still heard. Friends, that's why I've got confidence in the international monitoring system, is that we can detect any nuclear explosion anywhere at any time. And the infrasound technology is only one of 4 different types of technologies in our overall system. I continue to be amazed and inspired by the performance of the International Monitoring System and the analytical work of the International Data Centre. And I'm deeply grateful to all those who continue to contribute to its impressive capability, and particularly technical people here in Sweden. In this modern interconnected world, we've witnessed the increasing power and impact of civil society. The CTBTO encourages civil society engagement in our mission through various platforms, including the CTBT Science and Technology Conference, a biennial conference that we run. This platform is a fascinating combination of scientists, technologists, academics, students, and representatives of the diplomatic community, engaging in rich discussions on verification technologies and on the civil and the scientific applications of the CTBT's data. I'm also encouraged by the passion and the enthusiasm of the CTBTO youth group. Yes, we have a youth group. The CYG, as we call it, consists of more than 1,100 young people from over 120 countries, including those countries that are yet to sign and ratify the treaty. Inspiring the next generation of disarmament and non-proliferation advocates and promoting their engagement with the CTBT is a key priority for me. The next generation is already playing an important role in informing and shaping global attitudes on nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. And today, it is particularly important that we recognize that these goals are intergenerational and that we need to have awareness of the important issues of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation in the front of mind, not the back. So we have many different fora where the youth group gather together, but their advocacy and their support of our mission is deeply appreciated. Finally, I'm deeply committed to focusing our efforts on inspiring and attracting talent across gender, geography, and generations. Through a combination of strategic outreach and enhanced social media presence, we're aiming to promote the activities of the CTBTO and to raise awareness of the many opportunities to contribute to the noble goal of putting an end to nuclear tests. I'm determined to see the representation of women in our professional ranks in the CTBTO rise from 36% to equity. And with the assistance of Sweden and of all states that are party to the CTBT, I'm sure we can do this. I'll leave my opening comments there, but really look forward to the questions.
Rob, that's really fantastic. So many thoughts that kind of come up when listening to you. I think I have heard you talking about this before. I just pick up a little bit and I leave it with you, but you said that there's only been about a dozen nuclear tests since 1996 when the treaty was. I think it would be interesting, just as a brief comment, if you could help us to put that in perspective, how many tests were done between 1945 and 1996, and what this norm that Ann-Sofie was also talking about actually means in practice. If you could just very briefly, I think it will be interesting for you. Listen now.
Really happy to give greater context to that. Since 1945 through to 1996, when the treaty was open for signature, there was over 2,000 nuclear tests that took place. 2,000. That's a huge number of tests. And yet that 25 years from 1996, when the treaty text was available and states started signing, through to now, 25 years later, less than a dozen.
It's like several tests a week,
Indeed it is, yeah.
Now that, I think that's quite an important achievement to keep in mind when you talk about the success, how an international treaty can change behavior. So I just wanted to pick up on that. And we could also come back on the question of this, maybe a little bit technical, but quite important question of who need to ratify. in order for the treaty to, but we can come back to that in the discussion, because it's a particular number of countries that need to ratify for this treaty to really be ratified and enter into force. What you're saying about how this verification regime is actually not only detecting nuclear tests, but actually could help in preventing human suffering, tsunamis, etc. Quite impressive, I must say. So it's like a spin-off, secondary effect of an already great thing, which I think is important to remember. And lastly, what you say about working with the youth, just as a reflection. I mean, it might seem as if these nuclear issues are kind of oldish. This is Cold War stuff, but working with new generations, getting new experts who remember all the intricacies, and of course ultimately the human suffering of this makes it so important to work with the youth, and of course gender, etc., representation. Anyway, we will come back to this in the discussion. Thank you, Rob, and I would like to open up the panel now, and joining us in the panel is Vitaly Fedchenko. You are a senior researcher at SIPRI, Stockholm-based, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, just outside Stockholm, with a long experience in all things nuclear. And this includes nuclear security issues, the political, technological, and educational dimension of nuclear arms control, and also non-proliferation. You have worked at several other places, including the Center for Policy Studies in Russia and the Institute of Applied International Research in Moscow. You are also the author of several publications on international non-proliferation and disarmament assistance, the international nuclear fuel cycle, and Russian nuclear exports. I can think of no better person to join us in this panel. And instead of listening to me, I will now kick this off by a first question, which is focusing on the successes. It was mentioned, but I'd like to, and maybe starting with you, Vitaly, do you agree? I mean, with what Rob and maybe Ann-Sofi said, which are the biggest successes of the CTBT, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, even though it hasn't entered into force? And what has it brought to the arms control and international non-proliferation regime, and maybe ultimately to peace and international peace and security? What's your thoughts about that, Vitaly? Please.
Thank you, Jakob. Well, how did treaty contribute already to the international peace and security? Well, one very clear contribution has been mentioned already in this panel just now. I counted at least 4 times, and that is the creation of the nuclear test taboo, the international global norm against nuclear testing. And it has already been pointed out by Ann-Sofi that this norm is quite universal. Ann-Sofi mentioned that maybe just North Korea is the one who did not feel the pull of the norm, so to speak. But I can only add to that, well, first of all, I completely agree with Ann-Sofi on that, but I also could add that there are scholars in the academia who have looked into this issue, and there are some arguments being made that even North Korean nuclear program has been, let's say, influenced somehow by this taboo. It's a separate, maybe quite obscure discussion whether or not and to what extent that could be true, but at least the argument is being made that this is a truly global norm. Then another huge contribution is quite obvious, and again, this has already been mentioned, and that is halting the accelerated research and development of global nuclear weapon capabilities. Even though CTBT bans nuclear test explosions and it doesn't proscribe any other nuclear weapons related work, simulations, and so on. the ability of nuclear weapon states to drastically improve and invent new warheads obviously has been quite diminished by this. To speak to that idea, one can say that clearly, well, it's obvious that live nuclear test explosions are clearly important for development of new designs. And in the open literature, you can find illustrations to that effect. For example, there is a paper that states that France required 22 nuclear tests to develop its one TN-75 warhead design. 22. So there is another paper which says that for the US, that number is 6 on average. I don't know, I didn't check myself, but there's a paper. But in any case, it shows us that absence of live nuclear testing is drastically diminishing the capability. I guess the third point and third huge contribution is much more immediate. CTBT helped to curb very, very significant radioactive contamination. And I'm not just talking about radioactive contamination of the atmosphere. I'm also talking about local contamination of nuclear test sites. And just to put this into perspective, there is a UN body called UN Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation. And that committee assessed that nuclear weapon tests made the largest, by far largest, man-made contribution to the exposure of the world population to radiation since 1945. And the fact that that is not happening anymore, at least to the same extent, is obviously a contribution made by the treaty.
Thank you, Vitaly. These are, I mean, especially that law. Well, first of all, the nuclear test taboo, that's a good catchphrase, isn't it? And what you mentioned at the end about how the fact that there is no testing, virtually no testing any longer, helps ultimately to keep our environment. When I spoke with my wife about that, she was shocked to hear how many tests actually did happen and that we are not more hampered or damaged by it. That's another question, of course, but the fact that it doesn't happen is, of course, extremely positive for our environment, and not to mention, as you said, places like the Pacific and places in Kazakhstan and other places where a lot of those testing happened at the time. So, Ann-Sofi, turning to you, what do you agree with Vitaly about the successes? Is there anything we need to add or re-emphasize so that the audience really understands? And by the way, there are already questions coming in from the audience. Keep sending them in, but please, Ann-Sofi.
No, I can very much agree to what has been said. We have come a long way. Even, and I think that is quite unique that, formally the treaty is not into force, but, politically, diplomatically, and technically, you've been able to go a long way. I think that is very unique. I also want to come back to, the humanitarian consequences and the environmental consequences of if nuclear weapons would be, used again. If I did my homework well enough, there were not only 2,000 tests, but they were in 60 locations, around 60 locations all over the world during these 50 years before the treaty, and they are even today, very, very much damaged, and that, we should never forget how, the consequences if there would be any use again of nuclear weapons. And then we're talking about testing of them. So I think that is to be remembered. But then also, and I'm sure, Rob, you can continue on that, we should, of course, continue to work for the ratification and for the entering into force, because there are also on the technical side, you can do a lot, but there are things that could be further improved on that end when the treaty enters into force.
Thank you, Ann-Sofi. I mean, sobering reminders, 60 test sites around the world, 2,000 tests, and the damage that remains. Before we turn to the challenges and some of the questions I already put to you, I mean, is there anything that you would like to add on what you see as the successes and the usefulness of this treaty and the regime that we haven't really already covered, Rob?
Just two things to mention very quickly. We will talk a little bit more about 8 states that need to ratify this treaty so it can enter into force. But what I need to point out is that it's not because those 8 states don't support the CTBT. In fact, on a good day, every one of those states is a supporter of the noble goals of the CTBT. So the CTBT has near universal support, even though the signatures are 10 short of every state, but near universal support. That's my first point. That empowers us, and that empowers the treaty. And my second point is that to all states, no matter how large or small or where they're located on this planet, we are all benefiting from a global peace and security dividend of immeasurable value because of this suppression and this global norm on nuclear testing. That, Jakob, has got to be success.
I, of course, entirely agree with that. Would you care to maybe just mention which these 8 states are, and then, of course, hoping for the good day?
When the treaty was drafted, and with most treaties, one of the tricky areas is to define under what circumstances does the treaty finally enter into force and become legally binding. In the case of the CTBT, there was a list in Annex 2 to the treaty of over 40 states that all had, nuclear technological capability or potential. And it was agreed that all of those states had to ratify the treaty before it could enter into force. That 44 states is now only 8, but the treaty can't enter into force without those 8. So the 8 are a diverse set of states. And I'm going to do this in geographic order. I haven't memorized it in alphabetic order, but moving around the planet, starting from the west and heading to the east. So the 8 states are in the Middle East area: Egypt, Israel, Iran; South Asia, Pakistan, India; Northeast Asia, China, North Korea, and then the United States. They're the 8. Yeah. And you can see there are links between them, but they all support the CTBT, but due to their own strategic circumstances and point in time, they find it difficult to take that step at this point.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I think that's important for the audience and all of us to remember there. We also see the reasons maybe I think time is flying. I have some questions for the audience, but then if we could just briefly, with some brief answers, also touch upon what you see as the challenges here. And maybe, Ann-Sofi, would you like to start? I mean, I'm talking about it's been touched upon already a little bit, but how can we make sure that full implementation is done, and what are maybe the challenges to the broader non-proliferation and disarmament architecture?
I'll be very brief. Of course, the obvious one is that we would not come to ratification and enter into force if this continues. That could, of course, have consequences on the norm as we speak about now, that we find solid. So I think that is important. We need to continue working for these signatures, for ratifications, both with the annex states, but also the others. And then I think also the broader, if you would have a continued situation where the disarmament and non-proliferation regime is losing in solidness, and there would be more different rhetoric, not being careful, less confidence among states. Over time, this is of course a threat to the treaty and to the whole disarmament and non-proliferation regime.
Thank you. No, I mean, this is, apropos the point of that new generations will continue to stay seized with the matter and learn and understand what stakes are. Vitaly, what do you see as the key challenges?
I completely agree with Anne-Sophie about this. That erosion of that norm is indeed something potentially worrying. We have read in the newspapers in the summer of 2020 that Trump administration was reportedly discussing some kind of nuclear test demonstration. It didn't happen. Even before that, in the media, there have been different op-eds written, by the way, by rather young researchers, arguing that, well, actually, the use of a nuclear weapon is not that big of a deal. They would say things like an energy released from a largest nuclear weapon ever tested would still be less than an energy of a hurricane or an earthquake or something of that sort. And in that connection, I would like to commend the CTBTO initiative of working with youth that Dr. Floyd has just mentioned. I think one of the problems in there in particular that an absence of something means, like nuclear tests, means you're not afraid of it. If you did not see it, you don't fathom the power of it. So yeah, that's I guess what I want to say about it.
Rob, would you like to add? I mean, this is your everyday work. I mean, the challenges are great to talk about, but what requires most work are probably the challenges. We were in some of them already, but I have some questions on the audience, but I'll get to give you
very quickly, because I'd love to hear the questions of the audience. Two existential threats to the treaty is what I see. One is that a significant nuclear possessor state would return to testing. And my colleagues have already outlined that. That would have a reverberation throughout the whole CTBT community. The second, my colleagues have picked up on using different words, is that people would grow weary, that it hasn't entered into force. But I think both of these are issues that can be dealt with, and but they are ones that we need to look at head on.
Oh, very, very interesting, and of course daunting, and help us sharpening the mind. So we have a couple of questions here coming in from the audience. Thank you for sending them in. Several of the questions have to do with the ratifications of the Annex II states. So one question is ratification of the remaining Annex II states, the 8 states that Rob just mentioned, realistically achievable? And what is the practical difference considering the strength of the norm already established? And related to that, a question, what steps can be taken to encourage the remaining nuclear holding countries to ratify the treaty so that it can enter into force? Maybe I'll give that one to you, Rob, first, and then others could chip in.
Thank you. The Annex II states, the 8 that need to ratify, is it realistically achievable? It's not realistically achievable tomorrow, but in time, then I could see it happening. But in the meantime, we are still incredibly well served by this strong global norm. The reason it is such a strong norm is that it's actually backed up by the monitoring system. So it gives accountability and verification to it. So we are very fortunate. But entry into force allows the CTBT and the CTBTO to do other things which are not permissible before entry into force. This is an important point to get to. What steps can be taken? I have committed to getting into dialogue with all 8 of those countries to understand their context back in 1996, where they did or didn't sign the treaty. 5 of those 8 did sign the treaty. And then what is their current context and relationship to the treaty, their strategic context. But most importantly, what are the pathways of moving forward from where we are today to where we all want to be with their ratification? I don't want to go in with my pre-cooked understanding into those conversations, but I want to hear it from each of them and then to see how we can work our way forward.
Maybe turning to you, thank you, Robert. Turning to you, Anne-Sophie, representing a government. The organization is a sum of the will of the governments. How do you see this?
I think it's important to continue supporting the organization and be clear on what our expectations are for the treaty entering into force. So you need political, technical, financial backing in that regard, doing your job, showing that it works, but it can get better. And then I think we all have a responsibility. It's not only for the CTBTO to have those bilateral and other dialogues with the what we call the Annex II states, but all of us should have that. We work diplomatically. We have a meeting in the UN context. We are certain countries that work, but we should remember to bring this up. And we should also be part of what we do today, a public exchange and dialogue on the situation. And we should, remember to push this every day in our work. So there, I also believe that what you do I learned about your youth group, reaching out, having a public opinion. That is also important, not to forget that it works even without ratification. It does, but not fully. And we need to strive towards that.
I think those are very pertinent points that governments keep reminding and pushing diplomatically, and also stimulate discussion in the public domain. Whitley, you can speak independently as a researcher. Do you agree? What else could be done?
Well, I don't think I have much to add to what has just been said.
But actually, there was a related question which came in that I saw now, and that is what future steps would be considered major successes along the way to a world free from nuclear testing. So, I mean, are there kind of those steps on the way, kind of partial goals that, towards getting the 8 to have ratified and the enter into force of the, Rob, you seem keen to reply to that question. So please.
What I see as important is, from the CTBTO's point of view, we need to finish the verification system. We've got over 90% of the facilities, the 337 facilities around the world, over 90% are in place, but we need to get those last ones in place. We need to continue to build the capability within the International Data Center for the analytical capability for that to be able to be right at that level that when entry into force happens, that we're ready to go. We need to keep building the on-site inspection capability. This is a function, inspecting a site where there's a concern of something that may have happened, a function that can only happen after entry into force. So these are some of the things that we're working on. But as we do it, the peace and security dividend to all nations just improves and improves.
I mean, that's a very important point, that it requires not only political will, but resources to complete the full monitoring system and make sure that it continues to work as it should. And then on the on-site inspection issue, that is, of course, after, as you said, the entry into force, but still, it would be looking forward to that today. Would anyone else in the panel like to add on the milestones on the way on that question? Otherwise, we'll move on. Okay, then we have a question which is slightly wider here, and the question is, what implication does the possible blurring of lines between nuclear weapons and weapons like hypersonics and sophisticated cyber weapons and etc. have on the CTBT as a key ingredient to global stability? So is there such a link? Who would like to start? Rob seems to be keen. So.
No, I'm very happy to follow rather than lead, but
the quickest.
This is not a quiz show. It's who can get to the buzzer quickest. Look, the issue, I really appreciate that the questioner has raised the issue of hypersonics. When you look at a nuclear weapon, there is a nuclear device, that's the explosive device, and there is some delivery vehicle. Hypersonics is talking about delivery vehicles, some kind of missile that can travel faster than speed of sound. And the CTBT deals with testing of a nuclear device and does not deal with the issue of delivery systems. There are other arrangements that deal with delivery systems, hypersonics, cyber, etc. So from the CTBT's point of view, there's nothing that's blurred. We're focusing on the nuclear device itself.
Thank you, Rob. We are gently approaching the end of this hour, but I would like to give you an opportunity to give just one or two sentences of messages that you think we should take away, or the audience who are with us should take away from this. Is there anything? What do you think are the most important messages? Oops, sorry, Vitaly.
Well, I'm sure there are many important messages we can extract from today's conversation, but I think one important and positive one, I think, is that, first of all, yes, of course, as Dr. Floyd was just saying, CTBT as a treaty has a very clearly defined framework. However, the verification system for the treaty, the IMS, has been doing, we have already been discussing how it was contributing not just for the treaty verification, but also contributing to scientific efforts in all states, parties, big or small. It was contributing to studies of things like you mentioned yourself, tsunamis and climate change and all that. So I guess one of the kind of big takeaways is to say that CTBTO is, I would say, more than sum of its parts.
More than the sum of its part. Ann-Sofie.
Going back to where we started, we need to continue working through our multilateral framework. We build security together. We are all dependent upon each other, and there, especially in disarmament and non-proliferation, there is no way you need to be able to move together in order to build transparency, confidence, trust, take those steps, not the least when you look at arms control. I also want to then mention the upcoming Non-Proliferation Treaties Review Conference that we have been waiting for. It's been postponed due to the pandemic, but this is an important conference and meeting for the whole regime as the cornerstone of disarmament and non-proliferation and peaceful uses. So we all need to remember steps can be taken, maybe not major leaps, but it's worthwhile and we should not backtrack. We need to move forward with whatever we can. Everyone needs to do its best.
Thank you, Ann-Sofie. Final word goes to you, Rob. To the Swedish audience, what's your message?
Thank you, Jakob. My message is simple. When I was a student at university, the placards that were around were a lot of anti-nuclear placards. But if you go to a university today, the placards you see are more commonly climate change. But those placards point us to two existential threats that humanity faces. My point to the audience in Sweden, but the audience around the world, is may it never be that we lose focus on one of those existential threats and that we don't prepare to continue to reduce the risk of the existential threat of nuclear war.
Well, thank you for those powerful words, Rob, and I would like to thank you, all of you, in this fantastic panel. I think there are a couple of things that stand out, and that is that CTBT might be a difficult abbreviation, but what's behind it is an incredible success. It has changed behavior, it has more or less stopped nuclear testing, and it has improved or reduced or saved environments that might have been more damaged otherwise. And the numbers here, the few tests that are actually happening, I mean, with the exception of North Korea, wow, very impressive. The fact that Sweden has been so deeply involved for such a long time, from the 70s onwards, Ulla Dahlman up to today's Stockholm Initiative, very impressive, worth remembering, and maybe serve as an inspiration. So I think that today's buzzword was the nuclear test taboo that Vitaly mentioned. Let's continue on that score, and let's make sure that we keep focus on these existential issues. So a very warm thank you to all of you, and especially to our distinguished guest, Dr. Robert Floyd, Rob, and we will wish you all the best in your important continued work. You're always welcome back to the Institute and to Sweden, I dare to say, and also a warm thanks to Ann-Sofie Nilsson and Vitaly Fechenko for contributing with excellent remark. We will now close this webinar, but the Institute will remain seized by these issues and, of course, of the tragic events today. So please stay tuned. We will continue those issues. Thank you. Bye-bye.